Okay, share screen. There we go. Okay, we're coming now to the 5th chapter of the Hasidic discourse, Basi Legani. I came to my garden. And basically what it has been talking about up until now is that in the original plan for creation, when the universe was originally created, it was created in such a way that the divine presence was revealed in the lowest levels of creation. In fact, the whole intention of creation was that there would be, so to speak, a dwelling place for godliness. In other words, a place where God would feel at home, so to speak. How is this brought about? This is brought about through the idea of what's called in Hasidic terminology, Kabbalistic terminology, itkafia ve'ithapcha. Itkafia ve'ithapcha. Itkafia means self-subjugation. Ithapcha means transformation. We did not go into this whole concept very much. But suffice it to say that the idea of itkafia, self-subjugation, is only the beginning of the process. The ultimate goal of the process is actually to be able to come to transformation, called again ithapcha. Because when that happens, when the transformation comes about, then the transcendent light of godliness is revealed in the world rather than just the immanent light. This is actually a very fundamental concept in Kabbalistic studies and in Hasidic studies in particular. This idea that through ourselves, through changing ourselves, first of all, subduing the animal part of ourselves, and then transforming that animal part into a human part. In other words, that although everybody is born with animalistic tendencies, an animal soul, as it's called in the jargon, an animal soul, nefesh bahamit, nevertheless, it is possible in every case for the animal to be transformed into human. In other words, that there should be two divine motivations, rather than a self-indulgent animalistic motivation and then an altruistic godly motivation. Both of them should be godly, but they would work in a different direction. The altruistic godly tendency is sort of upward seeking, in other words, tends to shall I say, leave the world and cleave to God above, whereas the animalistic, once it's been transformed into holiness, into godliness, is to bring godliness down into the world. And that is the concept of ratzo v'shov, the rising and returning, or elevating oneself and then bringing everything down, bringing it all down to the world in order to make the world into a better place. And that's essentially the concept of the temple, of building this tabernacle, or building the temple that we started speaking about. The building of the temple requires a person to make this world around us here into a holy place. Now, part of the idea is nevertheless that there has to be some self-sacrifice. In other words, the sacrifices in the temple, the concept of sacrifice, that's the concept of aliyah, of ratzo, of ascent, the ascent of the soul on high. But that has to be balanced very much by the concept of bringing that godliness, what one achieves up there, so to speak, bringing it back down into the world. We began to explain that the animal soul, part of the animal soul, it's called a ruach shtus, a spirit of folly, of foolishness. The animal soul is only self-indulgent. It's only interested in its own in advancing itself, in helping itself. And it doesn't seem to realize most of the time that the way one can help oneself best is by transcending oneself to some extent. And he went on to explain this whole concept of ruach shtus, the spirit of folly, that covers up the truth, and it covers up the emotional qualities of the godly soul. In other words, the emotional qualities are invested in self-indulgent things rather than in altruistic and transcendent things. But nevertheless, it doesn't conceal the essence of the divine soul. It doesn't conceal the essence of the divine soul. Let me just make sure I have the chat up in case there's questions. Okay. Okay, so that was up until the end of chapter 4. Now we're on to chapter 5, and here we go. Again, Basi Legani 5:57:10, chapter 5. Okay. As we have seen, man has a potential for deviating from the middle path. The middle path is generally the path that is called the golden path in some places. The middle path means not going to the extremes, right? One shouldn't go to the left extreme or the right extreme, but sort of be in the middle of the road. But middle of the road does not mean mediocre. It does not mean mediocre. It simply means not going too far in one direction or the other. I think I mentioned last time the story with the Rebbe of Kotsk, the Kotsker Rebbe. The Kotsker Rebbe did not agree in all cases with this particular point of view. He said, look, the sidewalks are for human beings. The road, as in his day, there weren't cars yet, the road is for the animals. Like that's where the carts go, look at the horses pulling the animals. The middle of the road is for the horses. He was kind of an extremist in everything that he did. And he didn't like to maintain this sort of equilibrium position. But what he meant by that was that when you're striving to achieve something, you have to put everything that you have into it. It's not that you're just sort of traveling in the middle of the road and you go along with a crowd. We're about to examine that whole attitude. You don't just go along with a crowd to get along and go along and so on and so forth. One has to extend oneself beyond one's normal habitual self in order to get to a higher level. That's what the Kotsker Rebbe meant. He didn't mean that one shouldn't be a middle of the road person per se, but that in order to get to the middle of the road, you have to sometimes go to the extremes. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So as we have seen, man has a potential for deviating from the middle path. Lower than reason and understanding. This deviation by which he sinks to the level of an animal is called the folly of unholiness. So we're not talking about right and left necessarily over here, but we're talking about above and below. Right? To go below the medium, below the mean, is not a... it's like in the stock market, a sell-off. Well, this is a sell-out. You're selling out yourself when you go below the standard, the minimum standard that's expected of a rational human being. But just as a person has the potential to deviate below the mean with the spirit of folly, the spirit of unholiness, similarly, he has a potential for a deviation above reason and understanding. And by means of this deviation, he can approach self-transcendence. Now, when we say above reason and understanding, what do we mean? We have to be very careful about this and not assume that we mean to abandon reason and understanding. Abandoning reason and understanding is something that kind of that's an animalistic type of thing to a certain extent. Animals don't rely on intellect. Human beings are blessed with intellect, and therefore we should use it in the right way. What we mean by transcending reason is that sometimes it is important to do things just because, even if we don't understand them. This is actually an important part of Jewish thought altogether. The mitzvot, the commandments, are divided into those commandments which are just the loose division. Those those commandments which are called edus. Edus means a testimony. In other words, they sort of have a historical basis, and therefore we observe them. For example, celebrating the Exodus from Egypt, it has a historical basis. Celebrating the giving of the Torah, a historical basis called edut. Then we have mishpatim. Mishpatim are those things that are done according to intellectual understanding. In other words, certain of the mitzvot, for example, business transactions, have to be rational. They have to be run in a rational kind of a way. Otherwise, they're never going to work. And you can't run a society in an irrational kind of a way. It doesn't work, as we are seeing all around us today. In any event, there are those commandments which are called chukim. Chukim meaning those commandments which have no rational reason. We've been commanded to do them, but we haven't been given a reason as to why we should do them. So that's the kind of idea which we mean to deviate above reason. I think it was Aristotle that said, if I'm not mistaken, it was Aristotle, that said that he would never do anything without having a reason for doing it, without having a reason. We don't maintain that principle. We sometimes do things without having a reason, but the difference is that these are things that are being commanded by God. So automatically we know that they're the right thing, even if we don't understand them. And if we always looked to understanding, for example, let's say a person goes to the doctor and the doctor tells them you have to take a certain medication, you have a condition, you need a certain medication. Do I have to understand how the medication works before I take it? Of course not. You take the medication because someone told you that it was the right thing for you to do. And in order to be able to understand it the way the doctor understands it, you have to have his training. So if you want to spend 7 years plus experience trying to figure out how to why this medicine works, by that time you could well be buried because you didn't take the medicine. If you wait until you understand it, it's just simply not going to work. It's not the way to go. The way to go is to take certain things on faith, and then we try and understand them subsequently, if it is all possible. In any event, the idea of deviating above reason is also an important part of life. This level of conduct is also called folly, but the folly of holiness. Now, he's going to give an example of the folly of holiness. It's not what you think it is. It's not like blindly following some cult figure that without any understanding of what it is that you're doing. Not at all. You'll see how he explains it now. Thus we read in Kesubos. Kesubos is a Talmudic tractate, a tractate of the Talmud called Kesubos, which has to do with marriage contracts and various other things, many other things. But that's what the general subject is about. So we read in that tractate that it was said of Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Eloi, Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, that at weddings he would twirl a sprig of myrtle as he danced before the bride. In other words, he would try and do his best to make the bride and the groom laugh, as you could imagine, or perhaps you can't imagine, but when two people get married, the way it is in Jewish tradition, and certainly the way it was in the old days, even more so, they did not know each other very well. The bride and the groom, they had maybe met a few times, maybe even less than a few times, just a couple of times. And they both agreed to get married. People who knew both of them thought it would be a good match, and therefore they suggested it. The woman agrees and the man agrees, then they go ahead with it. But they really didn't know each other. And you can imagine on the night of the wedding, there's, they're nervous, they tense, and especially the bride. So this rabbi, was one of the famous rabbis of the Talmud. He would dance in front of the bride, and he would twirl a sprig of myrtle. Okay, in other words, he would he would do things to sort of make her happy, make her smile, and reduce the nervousness, kind of thing. I'll explain that a little bit more later on. The Talmud goes on to say that as Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak danced, he would juggle. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak was another sage mentioned in the Talmud. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, he would juggle 3 twigs of myrtle. He would actually juggle in front of the bride and the groom. He would throw one up and catch it, and throw another one up and catch it, and so on. He would juggle them, and that was obviously even more entertaining for and relaxing for the bride and groom. Said Rabbi Zera, this venerable sage is embarrassing us. Why is he embarrassing us? By making light of the respect due to Torah scholars through his undignified behavior. That's the way Rashi, the classic commentator, explains it, that he was doing things that were not dignified for a scholar and a rabbi of his stature. So Rabbi Zera, just by the way, they explain that Rabbi Zera, the word Zera actually means smallness from the word Zeira, smallness. In other words, there's a hint over here. It's only a hint because I'll explain in a minute. There's a hint that he was being a bit small-minded, right? He was only looking at things not from a broad perspective, but from a small-minded perspective. It's kind of a hint. This Rabbi Zera was actually a very interesting person. He eventually moved to the land of Israel from Babylon. He lived in Babylon initially, and he moved to the land of Israel. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is a body of work that is primarily dialectical in nature. What does it mean, dialectical? In order to be able to come to some kind of conclusion, there's a huge amount of argument that goes on, right? The Talmud Bavli, all the tractates of the Talmud Bavli, 60 tractates of the Talmud Bavli, are all based in argument and disagreement. They argue backwards and forwards, and then the most logical position usually wins out. And Rabbi Zera was an expert in the Babylonian Talmud. But when he moved to Israel, there's a different form of Talmud in Israel, which is called the Jerusalem Talmud. And there, it's not so much dialectical. There, the derivation of the law was explained, but the argument aspect of it was far, far, far less than in the Babylonian Talmud, and therefore it's much, much shorter. And in order to be able to grasp the Jerusalem Talmud or the Talmud of Israel, Rabbi Zera fasted 40 days. For 40 days he fasted so that he would forget the Babylonian Talmud. In other words, he would forget this dialectical way of thinking, and we would move more into the Jerusalem or Israel way of thinking, which was what's the derivation, and let's get on with it and come to the conclusion without all the arguments. In any event, so Rabbi Zera was a bit upset about the way Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak was dancing in front of the bride. So when he heard when Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak heard what Rabbi Zera had said, he said as follows: when Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak passed away, I'm sorry, not when he heard what he said, when he passed away, a pillar of fire appeared, separating him from all those who were near him. In other words, when he passed away, as they were carrying the bier, the coffin, to its burial place, and the custom in the Jewish custom is when a person, especially a person of stature, passes away, so all of his students and his family and many others come to pay the respects at the time of passing away. I mean, this is done in the world as well, but it's a very big thing, a big mitzvah, a very good deed when a person who's even not even related to the sage that passed away goes and he follows the bier. But in this particular case, they couldn't follow it exactly. They had to keep a distance because a pillar of fire separated between the coffin and the crowd. Rabbi Zera thereupon retracted his previous remark. 3 versions of his retraction are recorded in the Talmud. How did we retract that when he said this man is embarrassing us? He said as follows, the three versions. The first, the venerable sage has been well served by his sprig, by the branch of myrtle. He was well served by this branch of myrtle. In other words, shotei, the sprig of myrtle, which he used to dance with Rashi. Second version, the venerable sage has been well served by his folly, shtusei, not shotei, his branch, but his silliness. He's acting like a clown. And the third version was the venerable sage has been well served by his policy shitase, by his customary course of conduct. Rashi explains. In other words, he was well served. Whichever way you look at it, he was well served. In other words, obviously, if a pillar of fire is following the beer, that's an indication of the presence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and therefore Rabbi Zera understood that this was no ordinary person and he wasn't making a fool of anybody, least of all himself, and his actions were done with great thought behind them. So that's the kind of folly that we're talking about. Not folly by blindly following somebody else, but folly going beyond one's own intellect into areas that transcend intellect. And interestingly enough, in Kabbalah, there are areas which transcend the intellect. The three areas that transcend intellect are called the will, the power of will, the power of delight, and the power of faith. Those are all three areas, and they're all, I'll come back into you in a second, Ernest. Those three powers are called the transcendent powers of the soul, and that's what we mean by sometimes relying on the transcendent powers. I'll explain them more in a minute. I just want to explain Rashi. Rashi is the name, it's actually an acronym of a French sage whose name was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, he lived in like the 1100s approximately, 1100s. And he was a very, very great sage who has a commentary on the entire scripture and the entire Talmud. Very prolific writer and an incredibly gifted teacher. Okay. So these three transcendent levels of the soul actually correspond to the Sphira of Keter. Actually, let me just pull that up. I will pull up a soul powers. Strange. I'm not seeing what I should see here. So just one second. Sorry, folks. I will pull up a chart, but for some reason, here we go. All right, here we go. Sphirot and soul powers. Here we go. All right, so the Sphirot and the soul powers are Chochmah, Bina, Dat, and so on and so forth, all of these soul powers. But the transcendent soul powers, the transcendent powers of the soul belonging to Keter are faith, delight, and will. I see. Okay. Little note over here. All right. Okay, let's get back to the text. I'll leave that up for when we need it. So, folly of this kind transcends understanding and thus represents a wondrously superior mode of conduct. A superior mode of conduct. In other words, he was running his life from the level of Keter. He wasn't running his life from the level of the powers of the soul, but the transcendent power, the immanent powers of the soul, but rather from the transcendent powers of the soul. The following citation from the Talmud throws light on the non-rational, i.e. super-rational conduct of the above-named sages at weddings. It says as follows: if a man, Ish, and a woman, Isha, are found worthy, the divine presence abides between them. Don't forget, we're talking about a wedding right now, right? A wedding of a man and a woman. A man in Hebrew is called Ish, and a woman is called Isha. Now, if you see that the difference between them, actually, it doesn't really help to show the difference between them in that way. Let me just show you a new share. I will show you on a whiteboard. All right. I hope everyone can see the whiteboard. Yeah, you see the whiteboard, everybody? All right, this is the word in Hebrew for Ish, and that's the word for Isha. Ish means man, and Isha means woman. Yes? Man and woman. Now, the difference between them is that this has a letter Yud in it, and this has a letter Hey in it. And between the two of them, they share these letters here, right? That these letters spell the word Aish. Aish is fire, right? Fire. Sorry, my writing with the mouse is not the best. Fire. And then this over here spells the name Yud Hey. Oops. Yud Hey. Yud Hey is one of the divine names. The name that indicates the union of Chokhmah and Bina. Chokhmah and Bina. Chokhmah and Bina, the two highest imminent sfirot. So the fire of Yud-Kei is what happens when two souls come together. The fire of God. Man and woman is the fire of God between them, but in a positive sense, not the fire, not the fire of hell, the fire of God between them, right? Okay. So, good. Okay. He's going to explain this a little bit more. Stop share of that. Okay. For Ish, no, we want to share screen on the screen. Yeah, there we go. Okay. For Ish is composed. Ish is composed of Esh, fire, and the letter Yud. Isha is composed of Esh and the letter Hey. Right? So man and woman, they share the letters Aleph and Shin, which means Esh, fire. And man brings the Yud, and the woman brings the Hey. Together they make the name of God. When a man and woman are found worthy, either when they approach marriage in a godly way, the letters Yud and Hey combine. The letters Yud and Hey combine, as we said, to spell one of the names of God. It says the name of God, it's actually one of the names of God, it should be. Right? And therefore, when a man and woman come together in a proper way, then the Shekhinah, the divine presence, dwells in their midst. The Aleph and the Shin represent the Aish, the fire represents the fire of enthusiasm and warmth towards each other. And the Yud and the Hey is indicative of the divine presence between them. One gives the Yud, one gives the Hey. Together they form the divine name. Okay. Moreover, the divine presence then becomes manifest in the kind of marriage that is called an everlasting edifice. It's called an everlasting edifice, an everlasting building, right? In other words, an everlasting building, a marriage which reveals the divine presence between the husband and wife, between the man and the woman, is an everlasting building. It's something that will never dissipate or disappear. And therefore, it's very important in our relationships to work on our marriages and make sure that they are of the type that we can say about them, they're an everlasting edifice in a positive sense. Because a marriage thus elicits prodigious spiritual power, the joy of the sages at weddings would burst the conventional bounds of propriety. Because a marriage is such a holy occasion and such an occasion of joy, not only joy down below with them, the husband found his wife and the wife found her husband, but it's joy in heaven as well. It's not just joy down here. Because that idea of man and woman is also represented by man and God. It's the same relationship, except here it's man and woman. on the physical plane, and on the spiritual plane, it's man and God, the uniting of the soul of man with God. That's also a marriage in that sense. In fact, the time of the giving of the Torah was called the canopy at the marriage. That was the canopy when the Mount Sinai was lifted up over their heads. That was the canopy, the marriage canopy over the heads of those who received the Torah and God. Okay, so to speak. Just an image, and obviously we don't take that literally. Indeed, in the wake of the dancing of Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, he was granted a sublime revelation of divine favor. A pillar of fire appeared, separating from all those who were near him, a true revelation of divine light. Right now, the pillar of fire was obviously a divine event. It wasn't that someone was carrying a blowtorch, obviously. It was a divine event. Okay, so the explanation for the necessity for this folly of holiness, for this pattern of behavior that transcends reason, lies in the following teaching regarding the infinite Ein Sof light. Now, here is something that is very, very fundamental in Kabbalistic and Hasidic teachings, a very fundamental concept. Again, the necessity for this holiness is not something that is allowed. It's something that's necessary. One has to transcend oneself, and that transcending oneself is a foolish thing in a sense. We'll explain foolish in what sense shortly, but it's in a sense foolish because you're doing things not according to logic. If I'm doing things according to logic, I'm going to do what's good for me, right? Transcending myself is not necessarily good for me in the regular sense of the word. In other words, I'm not going to make any money from it, and I'm not going to make any get any power from it in the world, and I'm not necessarily improving my level of fame or whatever it is. But that transcending oneself, that folly of transcending oneself, folly in quotes, is the most spiritually satisfying event that could possibly happen. That's not why we do it, but the end result is that. Okay, so why is this necessary? What's the necessity for the spirit of folly? And the reason is as follows. No thought can grasp him at all. No thought can grasp God. God's mind cannot be grasped by human beings. God transcends the very category of understanding. The subtlest of spiritual concepts is still within the reach of the mortal mind, but that which transcends the very category of understanding is beyond the grasp of mortal thought. Again, let me just make sure I have the chat available. Okay, no questions so far. Okay. So this very category of understanding transcends the grasp of mortal thought. Transcends the very category of understanding. Okay. The Tanya, the famous Hasidic work written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman Diadi, expresses the concept as follows. In relation to the Almighty, who is beyond intelligence and knowledge, and who can in no way be comprehended by any thought, all men are like fools before him, as it is written, Anochi bar lo eida, I am foolish and ignorant. King David says this. Yes, I am foolish and ignorant. I am as a beast before you, and I'm constantly with you. Meaning, this is what King David said, meaning that because I approach you as a fool, not as a smart aleck, right? Not as a wise guy. I approach you as if I was a fool and a beast, just an animal without intellect. Now, animals have some rudimentary intellect, doesn't mean they don't have any, but compared with divine intellect, we're all fools, we're all beasts, we're all animals. We don't have intellect, we don't have consciousness. So, because I approach you as a fool and a beast, says King David, through the irrational power of faith, precisely therefore am I constantly with you. If we measure godliness in our minds, in other words, if the measure of godliness is your mind, our minds, then God is very small. If God can fit into your mind, so to speak, then God is very, very small, right? God transcends our minds, transcends our understanding, And therefore, the relationship to him cannot be entirely through mind. There's a certain aspect that has to be through intellect. And as you're probably all aware, Talmudic scholars and Kabbalistic scholars are usually very learned and very scholarly and very intelligent people. But that's not all there is to the relationship. If my relationship to God is only through my mind, then my God must be very small indeed. That's the way we see it. Okay, so we can do exhibit behaviors in our time that resemble folly of holiness, can be attributed as others as silly, offensive, foolish. Is folly of holiness in our time considered the same as what we are reading here, as long as the intention is needed? Do you do this at a wedding, and are we doing it as well in other areas of our lives? Yes, we do this at weddings, and in other areas of our lives as well. Yes, indeed we do. He's going to give some examples shortly, as you will see. Okay, so we continue. In order to relate to God's essence, we must make a self-effacing commitment that transcends the bounds of reason. Now, you have to be very careful of this. You have to be very careful with this, because what he's not saying is blind faith like in a cult. He's not saying blind faith in a cult. He's saying there's certain aspects of things that transcend intellect, and we have to recognize that that is the case. We have to recognize that that is the case. But to do things without any rationality at all, to do things that are that don't make any sense at all the time, that's real folly. That's not just the folly of holiness. It's a fine balance. Okay, we have to be obviously careful to make sure that we get the balance right. Okay, so again, in order to relate to God's essence, one must make a self-effacing commitment that transcends the bounds of reason. Hence, this level of spiritual attainment is also called folly, because it transcends reason. It's not below reason, it's above reason. Okay. Similarly, we find a prophet referred to as a madman, as in the verse, why did this madman come? It's referring to Elisha the prophet, and one of the kings who he comes to rebuke just sort of dismisses him as a madman, right? Meshuggah. Now, what does this mean? We will see what the idea is of the madness of a prophet. For during the revelation of prophecy, a person has to divest himself of materiality. In order to be able to prophesy, in order for the Spirit of God to run through a person and shine out, he has to get rid of himself or herself. He has to step beyond his understanding and emotions and attain a level of self-nullification beyond all limits of reason. Self-nullification to the divine, to the Almighty. And since prophets were able to do this, they trained for many years in order to be able to do this, to transcend themselves. So that's is why they're called, in some cases, they're called nuts. They're called Meshuggah, crazy people. No, not everyone who's crazy is a prophet. We all know that. Okay, enough said. Okay, for this reason too, prophets would remove their clothing during prophetic revelation. As we find King Saul removed his clothes and prophesied. Now, this is not always meant in a literal sense, that a person gets undressed. Actually getting undressed in the divine presence is not appropriate. What does it mean? It means that the garments of thought, speech, and action are stripped away. The garments, these are called the garments of the soul, levusha hanefesh. The garments of thought, speech, and deed and action are stripped away, and the essence of the soul is revealed. Right? The garments are stripped away. Normally, we act through those garments, thought, speech, and action. We live through those garments. But at certain times of self-transcendence, we we're elevated up beyond the level of the garments, as we'll see shortly where they come from, and are able to express the soul without any garments. There's an expression in that people use in Hasidic terminology, and it's filtered through and sort of seems to have seeped through into Israeli culture as well to a certain extent. The expression is as follows: tell me without your pants on. In other words, don't hold back. If there's something that you need to tell me, and even if it's something that you think I don't want to hear because it's a criticism of me or something like that, tell me without your pants on. In other words, don't be afraid to say it the way it is, right? Tell me without. It's an expression, but it's an expression which comes from the same source. That tell it straight, tell it the truth without hiding it in all kinds of garments that tend to obscure and obfuscate the real core of what it is that needs to be transmitted. Okay, so we find that Shaul also removed his clothes and prophesied. Now, as far as Saul is concerned, it could be that he actually did remove his clothes. I don't know. But yes, speaking from the neshama, not the nefesh, exactly. And speaking from the neshama and not the powers of the nefesh, which are even lower than the nefesh. That's correct, thank you. The need for clothing, first came about as a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's where clothing actually came from. Before the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we were able to relate to God directly. In other words, without clothing, without the garments around the soul is able to relate directly. Before the sin, Adam and his wife were naked. Now, does it mean that they were actually naked in physical sense? Yeah, it probably means that also. Right? In fact, that's the simple, straightforward explanation. But it means much more than just that they didn't have, a shirt and pants on. It means much more than that. It means that the soul was revealed. It wasn't covered by all kinds of garments and by all kinds of limiting modes of expression. The naked truth is a good way of saying it. Exactly. Yep. Okay. So before the sin, Adam and his wife were naked, and they were not ashamed. After the sin, man's feelings hitherto instinctively good, until this time instinctively good, comprised both good and evil. From now on, it will be good and evil. Indeed, this is the core of their sin, as is implied in the later verse. They knew that they were naked. Now they knew that they were naked. They knew that when they didn't have garments, they knew. So they therefore, and what was exposed without the garments, they didn't like. They were ashamed of, because they had ruined it. They had tainted the soul to a certain extent. Only on the outer edges of it, but nevertheless they tainted it. And therefore they were embarrassed and had to cover it up with clothing, so to speak. They knew they were naked. At this point, they first felt the need for clothes. The ultimate source for the experience of feelings comprising both good and evil is one's awareness of his own intellect and emotions. Again, the ultimate source for the experience of feelings comprising both good and evil is one's awareness of his own intellect and emotions. Our intellect and emotions can often lead us astray, and therefore can lead us into the bad. They can also lead us into the good. So therefore, intellect itself is not good or bad, and the emotions are not necessarily good or bad. They could be either. In fact, it could be both. But in order to be able to get to the core, to the truth, we have to strip away that intellect and emotions, because they're comprised of good and bad. Prophecy thus demands divesting oneself of one's clothes, i.e. divesting oneself of this awareness of self, of one's own intellect and emotions, and nullifying one's own faculties and sensibilities. Now, this is not just a Kabbalistic concept. This is, in fact, normative Jewish thought. The Rambam, that's Maimonides, who was not known as a Kabbalist, although there is a work called the Rambam and the Kabbalah. The Rambam apparently, from what some people say anyway, he apparently knew the Kabbalah, particularly of one named Rabbi Avraham Abulafia. about Abraham Abulafia, a very interesting Kabbalist who was quite a character in and of himself. But anyway, I'm digressing. The Rambam thus writes in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, he writes in the foundations of the Torah, foundational laws of the Torah. He writes as follows: it is one of the fundamental tenets of the faith, of Jewish faith, to know that God grants prophecy to men. When we say men, we mean man in general. We don't mean men as opposed to women. There were women prophets as well. Esther was one of the women prophets. Sarah was one of the women prophets. Ruth was one of the prophetesses, and so on. And there were Huldah, there were many others. Prophecy will rest only on a man, a person, who is wise and courageous, who overcomes his desires and whose desires never overcome him in any manner, him or her. So again, prophecy will rest on a person. In other words, a person will be able to attain that spirit of self-transcendence, that spirit of the revelation of truth, only if a person is wise and courageous. It needs a lot of courage. You need to go against the grain and swim against the stream sometimes. And who overcomes his desires, he transcends his own self-indulgent desires, and whose desires never overcome him in any matter. Now, this is a matter of a tremendous amount of work, in order not to be overcome by one's desires. It usually demands a lot of practice and a lot of work. And as the expression goes in Hasidic terminology, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is a kluginker. He's very smart, How do you know that he's smart? Because he outsmarts you all the time. That he must be smarter than you. And since you're smart, he must be even smarter, right? In other words, you often find yourself doing the wrong thing. Well, let's not say you. People often find themselves doing the wrong thing in retrospect. How did I get into that? How did I do that? How did I do such a foolish thing? It's called the spirit of folly, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is not in itself evil. It's an inclination to evil. We have that natural inclination towards evil. After the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we have a inclination towards evil. In other words, towards self-indulgence and obscuring the truth. Okay. In any event, such conduct, the conduct of a prophet, which entails a deviation that transcends the accepted norms of reason and understanding, is called folly. That's what we mean by folly, something that transcends the accepted norms of reason and understanding. So everyone in a society, there's certain societal norms that everyone takes for granted, right? They just take them for granted because that's the way it's always been done. And one never stops to think, well, why is it done that way? Is it really worth doing it that way? Or is there a better way? And very innovative people and courageous people will often find that things are not going to be done that way. We're not going to do them that way. I'm going to do them in a different way. I'm not telling you what to do, but I will do them in a different way, that kind of thing. Okay. So having now understood the two levels of folly that is below reason and folly that is above reason and transcends reason, we can now revert to the explanation of why the Mishkan had to be built specifically of acacia wood. The beams of the tabernacle were built with acacia beams. Now, acacia trees in Hebrew is called atzei shittim. Atzei shittim, related to the word shtut, as we just said, related to the idea of foolishness or folly, holy folly. As stated above, the intent of the divine service in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, was to transform darkness into light, to the degree where the darkness itself would become luminous. In other words, there's two ways in which darkness and light interact. Well, three ways really. Darkness and light interact in one sense by not interacting. The domain of light is light, the domain of darkness is darkness, never the twain shall meet. Night is night, day is day, and two different things, right? That's one possibility. The other possibility is that when light and darkness meet, then light pushes out the darkness, right? When the light comes in, the darkness goes out. You light a candle in a room, and that brightens up the room. Incidentally, this is a method, the preferred method of psychoanalysis or psychological analysis or whatever you want to say, not looking for the dark corners of the person and trying to fathom how deep they are, but rather just bringing a light into that dark place without analyzing and examining the dark place per se. Bring a light into the place and everything lights up. It's a whole different way, whole different approach, right? This is an approach which was definitely favored by the Baal Shem Tov and those that followed his path. Okay, so that's the second way, is to drive out the darkness by bringing in the light. The third and the highest way of doing things is to transform the darkness itself into light. In other words, not that the darkness itself is now replaced by light, but that the darkness itself begins to shine. The darkness becomes a source of light. Now, what does that mean? Well, essentially it means that when a person transforms his negative impulses in such a way that they become positive impulses to positive rather than to negative, to good rather than to evil, then the evil itself, so to speak, has been transformed. In other words, the beams of foolishness now become the beams of the tabernacle, tabernacle in the desert. They become holy objects in and of themselves. Okay, so again, the intent of divine service in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the base of Mikdash, the temple, was to transform darkness into light, to the degree that where the darkness itself will be luminous, i.e. to transform the spirit of folly that stems from the other side, the side of unholiness, into the folly of holiness. Good. So the Mishkan was therefore made of acacia wood, I say shittim, whose very name, the holy tongue shittim, echoes the word for folly, shtus. In other words, a transformation of the folly of the world into the folly of the transcendent world, where it does embody the principle that conduct which is folly in the sense that it is lower than reason, or to be transformed into conduct which is folly in the sense that it transcends reason. So that which is below reason can be transcended into that which is above reason. And that is a transformation in the person that is completely illuminating. Okay. So now we may more fully appreciate the teaching. And they shall make me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell among them. Meaning to say, God dwells within each individual, within each person through his divine service, his or her divine service, a personal refinement which transforms darkness into light. The work of transforming darkness into light and thus making a dwelling place for godliness. This is what he brought us here for. This is what we're living in this world for, to transform darkness into light. And through his efforts, through the person's efforts of turning the sub-rational elements of the world into the super-rational elements of the world. And therefore you will find very often, interestingly enough, you will find that people who are called Baalei Tshuva, people who are not brought up religious but become religious, are much more fervent in their approach than people who were born into the faith and were brought up that way as well. There's much more energy behind it. And some of the very famous people in Jewish history were in fact people who they or their parents either converted to Judaism or they converted from, not converted, but changed from being people who lacked knowledge into people who were tremendous sources of knowledge. Rabbi Akiva is one example. There are many others. Okay, on a practical level. The same is said of a ger, exactly. Yeah, the same is said of a ger. A ger is a convert, someone who converts to Judaism. And some of the greatest gerim in history were, for example, Onkelos. Onkelos, the person who first translated the entire Torah into Aramaic, a faithful translation from Hebrew to Aramaic. There were the parents of Rabbi Akiva, there was Rabbi Meir, there were many others that actually became great some of the greatest sages. One of my teachers, who now, he lives in Israel. He lived in Israel at the time too. But one of my teachers when I was in yeshiva in Israel was a Ger Tzedek, a righteous convert. A very interesting person. So, the Ernest says as follows: amazing to reinforce that the experience of immaturity, folly, is a necessity to transformation. Just like life itself as an infant to adult seems to not reinforce mistakes as a youth as something bad. Yes, that's true. Yeah, we all make mistakes in our youth, but those mistakes can be transformed into good things. One of the people that you see this very much emphasized, I'm sure everybody knows Tony Robbins. He emphasizes this concept a lot, how the folly of youth can be transformed into the wisdom of, let's say, middle age, of the wisdom of people. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was also a person who had tremendous faith in the youth for making the changes in society which were necessary. The old fuddy-duddies, they're stuck in their habits, they're stuck in their ways, they can't change anything. It's the youth, the youngsters, that come with fresh blood and fresh energy and fresh ideas. And yes, they might be coming out of a lifetime spent in foolishness so far, but they're young enough to be able to transform that into the highest level of wisdom. That's the fact. Hank said, Ger Toshav. Yeah, Ger Toshav is a little bit different. A Ger Toshav does not actually convert to Judaism, but remains with the religion that he or she was born with, but takes upon themselves the 7 Noahide laws and lives in a Jewish community or whatever it is. But they're 2 different kinds of gerim. Okay, good. So Ernest actually, I'm sure, has come across this many times with some of his proteges, the people who grow up under his guidance and tutelage, him and Wendy, who run a home for basically troubled youth, sometimes often abandoned youth, and they do wonders with them. So Ernest could perhaps tell us some of his experiences, and maybe one day we'll arrange that, if it's okay with you. Okay, let's continue. So, on a practical level, how does it connect with the 40 years of adult Israelites wandering in order to die off? Let's leave that out for now. We'll get there. It's actually next week's Torah reading. And maybe if we finish off the Mimer, I'll speak about it. If we finish off this discourse, I'll speak about it next week. Because it's Pasha Shlach that actually explains that idea. Okay, let's continue. So on a practical level, there are things that people do only because everyone else does them, as you know. Why do we do these things? Because everyone does them. There was always a sort of... maybe it's a bad example. Let's take the example of tattoos now. Everyone has a tattoo, so people start getting tattoos. They don't realize that it's not so easy to get rid of them afterwards. Everyone gets, dyes their hair pink or something like that. So everyone, so you all dye your hair pink. Okay, it'll grow out. But why do we do these kinds of things? Like, what's the reason? And there's certain ways that we do things. There's certain ways of doing things. That's what we've always done. That's what my parents did. My grandparents did. Why not? Now, this can be transformed into, transferred into all levels of society. And you may ask the very same question about, follow the leader, the mother duck concept. Exactly. Yeah. You may find this, to be very typical of religious Orthodox Jews. They all wear the same thing. The reason for that is slightly different, actually. It's not so much follow the leader, but that clothes should not be what differentiate people from one another. If everybody wears more or less the same kind of clothing, even the same color of clothing in many cases, then we have to emphasize something much deeper in order to differentiate ourselves from others. Our differentiation is in the degree to which we make ourselves available to help other people, or the degree to which a person makes themselves available to a divine relationship, or both, without clothing having to be, because as we said before, clothing is a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay. Anyway, let's continue. Certain folkways that are conveniently held to be proper, for example, crystallize into unalterable laws. Like you have to eat 3 meals a day. You have to have cereal and milk for breakfast. There's all kinds of things that we do without thinking exactly why we're doing them. Such unreasonable habits ought to be transformed through one's endeavors. Instead of remaining below reason, they should be elevated to above reason. He gives an example. Business community commitments, for example, pressing as they may be, do not generally overrule the times that convention prescribes for eating and sleeping. In other words, if convention prescribes that eating dinner is at 7 o'clock, right, whatever, eating dinner is at 7 o'clock, you make sure you're home by 7 o'clock. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you've got to run a normal household and so on and so forth. But these kinds of conventions become habits, so that we kind of can't move outside of them. I mean, this is just a very minor example, but there are things that we do in our ways of relating that are that's because what everyone does. An example of this would probably be racism. That's the racist attitude was because that's the way everyone thought, right? One has to get beyond that. A human being is a human being. Color of the skin is irrelevant, and so on. Okay. So they do, however, sometimes set aside or even cancel the fixed times that should be regularly scheduled for Torah and study prayer. So it's dinner time. How can I study now? It's time for dinner. It's not possible to study when it's dinner time. You can't study at dinner time. You can't study at lunchtime. In other words, if a person is busy with deeply sinking into some particular concept and idea, whatever, and study, and all of a sudden the clock strikes, it's 1 o'clock, lunchtime, tools down, off you go. Lunchtime. And that shouldn't necessarily be that way. Yes, it's true that a person should make one's life, let's say, ordered in the proper way, but it doesn't have to be silly. It doesn't have to be silly. Yeah. Race as well. Yeah, that's for sure. I didn't realize the time is already well after 9. Talking about going over the time. Okay. So probably we should leave this until finish it off next time. We don't have much to go, but I don't want to keep everyone from going to bed. In some places it's already late. It's already 10 o'clock and after 10, so we'll leave it at that. My apologies. No one said anything, so I didn't even notice. Okay, folks. If anyone wants, the recording will be up on the website, Kabbalah Decoded, and also at on our channel on YouTube, Kabbalah Decoded. So my yawning out. Yeah, I usually get up very, very early in the morning. Get up very early. I try to be up by 5 o'clock, 5:15 every morning, and I don't get to bed usually until quite late. So that is